We move now to the first lecture on the world system, where I will try to give you some cornerstones for an analysis of the political and economic context. And later, after lunch, Francesco Strazzari will discuss the more specific international relation and conflict issues. The question that we are addressing now, war and peace, have been addressed with a very large variety of approaches and ways. What our argument in this school as a whole, and in particular in my lecture, is that we can hardly understand the dynamics of war and peace without understanding deeply their context. We have been flooded by narratives and media stories about geopolitical determinism, the nature of a country, the nature of a leader, the constraints of geography, religious factors, cultural factors, the inevitability of clashes, and so on. And we are completely opposed to such explanations of war and peace. We have to understand the structural aspects. At the same time, the more simplistic stories of international relations, the logic of state as a rational actor within a specific interest, with specific strategies, with objectives and tools, it leaves a lot to be desired, and you will hear more on this from Francesco Strazzari later. What we argue is crucial is the political economy of the world system as a key driver of the world order. And conflicts emerge within the context of the contradictions and problems in the both political and economic dimensions. So in the political dimension, we have to pay attention to the hierarchy of states, but also pay attention to other actors, financial power, multinational corporations, civil society groups, peace movement themselves, okay? And in the economic dimension, we have to understand what is capitalism, because unless we understand capitalism, it's very difficult to understand today's type of nature. So a very simplistic way of summarizing this approach is to look at the world system as the combined dynamics of, on the one hand, the economic system shaped by capitalism, where the key driver is the process of accumulation of capital, both at the national and at the global scale, where the key contradiction is between capital and labor, profits and wages, and the dynamics of capitalism move in terms of production of goods and services for profits, but also for increasingly with the financial dimension, where profits are made out of the simple circulation of money. In parallel, what is produced is going to be distributed, and there are struggles over distribution, and therefore income and wealth inequality, class divisions, the other type of individualization and group dynamics. The way of understanding the evolution of capitalism is through the idea of cycles of accumulation, because there are different contexts in which this process takes place. In parallel, we find the state systems and the political processes with the power as a key driver, with a structure of center-periphery structure in the world order, where we have interstate relations, intrastate political processes. Here we have the question of democracy, which has been developed a lot, partly at the national level with some step backs, but has been hardly been asserted as a key pillar of the international order. So that's an interesting question. And of course, conflicts shape the political processes. In terms of policies, what we can understand that the policies carried out by states and governments as ways in which the state supports the process of capital accumulation and economic growth on the one hand, organizes distribution, but also tries to emphasize the strength of the national economy and the national political process in the international scale. So we have a two-way connection between economic processes supporting the strength of political power of states, but also the political power of states supporting the economic dynamics of nations, okay? And we understand this political process at the global level as cycles of hegemony. Where is war and the military? We add a box with the military sphere. The logic here in this case is the logic of armed power, the use of legitimized violence by the power of the states. And here we have political goals, in theory, protection and security, and military means, strategy, types of conflicts, arms races, armed forces, and the economic and technology base. How this military dimension is related to the other two dimensions? Through, of course, is within in modern states, military power is part of the state, and therefore we have government military relations within a given institutional setting at the national level. And with the economic processes, we have this what has been defined the military-industrial complex. So the combination of use of large economic resources made available by the growth of national economies for military purposes, and at the same time, in turn, military activities can support the growth of economic activities. Think of military industry receiving procurement demands. So in the more specific interaction in economic terms, in what we can call the war system of the military-industrial complex, is the interaction between this set of activities, military expenditure, arms industry, the concentration of resources of all types in military activities, but also the concentration of financial resources and the collection of debt, that as a way of funding military power, with long-term and short-term effects in economic activities. And on the other hand, all these economic resources support arms races, war preparation, threats, cold wars, and conflicts. This is a very schematic conceptualization which can help us locate the combination of political power, military power, and economic power in their interaction. In my lecture, I will rely on 3 or 4 fundamental contributions, which I think are very useful to understand and learn how we can conceptualize and do research on these things. The first contribution comes from the world system approach. The most important book is Giovanni Arrighi's book, The Long 20th Century, also translated into Italian, which builds on Fernand Braudel, historian work on modern Mediterranean societies, Immanuel Wallerstein, Samir Amin, Andre Gunder Frank, Beverly Silver. And this approach looks at the world system as the scale in which we have to understand national and international dimensions, both economic and political and social. And the idea is that there is a succession of world systems guided, dominated, ruled by Genoa and the Spanish Empire in the 1600s, the Netherlands as a modern empire in the 1700s, the British Empire in the 1800s, and the United States in the 20th century. Between one period of domination and the other, as we will see, we can expect periods of systemic chaos with long periods of transition, and systemic chaos is a period where wars are more likely to happen. So very following up on these concepts, world systems are shaped by cycles of accumulation in capitalism and cycles of political hegemony. The strongest economic power becomes the ruler of the world system, for a period, and in turn, the ruler of the world system has the power to shape the economy and shape the process of capital accumulation. But we have to distinguish two phases of capital accumulation, one phase of material expansion, when there is an expansion of the real economy, jobs, goods, technologies, and so on, and then the contradiction of this type of expansion lead to a crisis, more competition, and the reaction of capital to the crisis is the shift to a more financial dimension. And this was pointed out by Brodel in Genoa and in Venice in the Renaissance period, and it was typical of the Dutch case, but was all typical of the British case, that after the Industrial Revolution, concentrating the modern industrialization power in the real economy, shifted to a financial power at the end of the 19th century. And this is also typical of the US, with a shift after the 70s from being the best performer in the real economy of the world to being one of the worst performers in the real economy, with the loss of industrial base, and becoming the center of the financial world order with Wall Street. So these two phases, material expansion and financial expansion, are very different and shape the cycle of political hegemony. And one argument by Fernand Braudel, looking at history, is that when the power shifts to financial activities, this is the sign of the autumn of power, so decline sets in. An interesting contribution for this work is this other book, Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System, which is a more specific reconstruction of the succession of and transition in world systems. Just to remind you, we have been different waves of material expansion driven by technological growth, the Industrial Revolution, then later the turn of the 20th century, the age of electricity and steel, then the Fordist wave of mass production with car production, the rise of managerial capitalism, and the dominance of the US industrial model. And then after the 80s, we have the age of information and communication technologies in its various varieties. Now we are in the digital age, the age of artificial intelligence, and these technological and structural production bases are very important for the way in which the cycle of accumulation takes place, who makes profits, how profits are made, what is the scale of markets, what type of labor is used, what type of struggles and conflicts, both at the national level and abroad, are carried out. This is just to give you a sense of how this succession of hegemonies can be conceptualized, but we can skip this. This is the dynamics of material expansion. You will have all the slides in the website. So in the slides, there are more information that you can look at later. What is interesting is that in the phase of financial expansion, what is changing? Profits are not made by the use of labor and capital in production, are made by the ability to manipulate capital flows. And in the current age, the most important aspect is the global nature of financialization, with the ability of the US in particular to concentrate capital flows from all over the world. All the rich of all countries bring their capital to the US, and this has become a fundamental strength of the US model at the same time since the 80s. And while in the past finance was rather simple, banks lending to kings, or banks lending to individuals, or banks lending to firms for new investment in new activities and new technologies, now finance has become a casino, complex speculation, bitcoins, crypto activities, all sorts of things where the ability of abstract money to multiply itself and accumulate greater wealth has become largely out of control of the traditional political process. You remember that in your textbook, you always read that the power to produce money and control money was a fundamental power of the sovereign. So the state was made in order to make war and to make money. Okay, but this is not anymore the case, and as a matter of fact, the blurring boundaries between the ability of political institutions to control the production and circulation of money and the emergence of other forms of financial activities is central to the uncertainty of today's. Looking at the past world systems, the weakness of financial activities, the fact that financial activity is not based on real wealth, on real activities, meant that this was a weakness of the system, and in the past, the collapse of previous hegemonic cycles, up to the British one in the, at the beginning of the 20th century, with the great crisis of 29 being an important point, was driven by the weakness, the emptiness of the process of financial accumulation. So terminal crisis, when a cycle of accumulation, the cycle of hegemony ends, emerges in particular, can be expected to emerge in particular at the end of these phases. Just to give a sense, we always have to use concepts, but also data, okay? Just to give you a sense of the difference between material and financial expansion, this is the early post-war decades, the 60s and 70s. This is total world GDP growth. The average was about 5%. After the 1980, neoliberalism, financialization, and slowdown of the West, the world as a whole, not just the West, has grown at much lower rates in spite of China being somehow here, okay? So the average of the world has been lower, and this means that the world capital accumulation has slowed down in this context with a more serious crisis. This is the 2008 collapse of finance. So let's look at some hard data, and of course, this after the crisis of 2008, European GDP has been flat, US GDP has grown very slightly, China's GDP has grown 230%, okay? So we are monitoring, and BRICS are in the middle, India and the others. So what we are really experiencing in real terms is a shift of the center of material expansion to Asia, China, India, and other countries, and a stagnation and decline of the traditional Western economies. Okay, so that's the first conceptual part. So how we put together political processes, economic trends, and how the military dimension sneaks in. Second issue, what is, if we talk about a world order, the world order can be understood as a particular configuration of a world system of political and economic power. And the concept of hegemony is very important because this is a concept which allows us to understand the stability and the emergence and also decline of a particular world order. The idea of hegemony comes from Antonio Gramsci, who was looking at liberal and fascist Italy. And the idea of Gramsci was, how do we understand also the consensus that fascism had in Italy, and the diversity of ways in which different political projects can develop, including, of course, radical projects, socialism and communism. When a ruling class exercises a political, intellectual, and moral leadership, shaping the direction of change of the country and organizing consent rather than just enforcing domination, we are looking at the hegemonic power of a state or a political project. So consent as well as power, but power exercised not simply through brutal domination and the use of force. And therefore, it is very important, the ideology, the worldview, the narratives, we would say, that give an explanation to a particular interpretation and pattern, but at the same time, it are very important the economic and political structures, the institution, the social relations that are relevant in this context. The idea of a hegemony was shifted at the international level, and Giovanni Arrighi was one of the first who did this extension. In the context of interstate relation, however, what do we have? We have mainly states with weak international relations, structures of international relations, and no democratic political process. So in the case of international relations, the question of consent versus brutal force domination is a very stark one. And again, we can have a dominant state which can shape the direction of change for the world order through the power of leadership and political consensus, building alliances, and producing a possibility of growth and consensus for other countries, or we can have a powerful state which uses its military power to subjugate and control other states. So these shades of uses of power are very important to understand the complexity of this issue and the hierarchy of things. A lot of international relations studies think of states as like economists think of firms as all equal. Okay, with interacting on the basis of their interest and logic. We are not talking about equal actors here, we are talking about hierarchies, and within each hierarchy we have different mechanisms of control and power. So center-periphery dynamics becomes very important. By the way, a side story is that if we understand the world in this way, there is no contradiction between state and market. The state creates market, and the markets create the state. And in other words, the effective functioning of market power contributes to the political strength of political power, and vice versa. The state can, before having market competitiveness operate, creates the institutions and the rules and the capabilities for having a market. This is very important because we have been, after the 80s, we have been living in a period of neoliberalism where the idea that markets were better than the state at organizing society and that the state had to be reduced and so on, emphasized this state versus market opposition. But as a matter of fact, it was the state and the political power, starting from Thatcher and Reagan in 1979-1980, who decided the political withdrawal of the state from many activities, and at the same time the creation of financial markets, competitive markets in public services, the privatization of public services, and so on. So political power can expand or contract markets, can decide what is sold in the market. For instance, university education in the US is sold in the market. In Italy, so far, here we are lucky that it's not a commodity sold in the market, but is a public service paid by the state, provided on the basis of the social rights of people to education. Okay, this is a very important distinction. So This helps us to understand the evolution of the balance between politics and economics. And again, however, when we have the ending of an hegemonic cycle, we are going to have a period of systemic chaos. We will come back to this later, but let's just remember that the periods of systemic chaos are periods when there is an opening, the weakening of the power system of the world system with the weakening of the hegemonic control by the old leader over the other actors, opens up possibility for new actors to challenge the order, to use wars and military power for short-term games, including regional strategies or global alternatives. So we have in a period of systemic chaos, we tend to have a lot of local regional wars because there is more space and less control about them, but we have also the risk of escalation of these wars and the risk of the emergence of a systemic confrontation at the world order. So this was the concept of hegemony. Now let's go more in detail on the issue of conflicts, war, and states. And here we have this wonderful article that you have in your folder by Charles Tilly, War Making and State Making as Organized Crime. Is really a very important contribution. It's interesting because here we're reading things that were written 20 or 30 years ago, but they are incredibly powerful also for understanding our lives today. Tilly was a historian of the European state formation from the 15th century on, and had a deep knowledge of how the Kingdom of France became the first important nation state in Europe through the consolidation of the feudal system and so on. He studied also revolution, civil society, struggles, social movement, and so on. And and in this article, he argues that if protection rackets represent organized crime at its smoothest, then war risking and state making qualify as our largest examples of organized crime. Of course, they have the advantage of legitimacy, but the boundary between what is legitimate violence and what is not of course, depends on who has the power to define something legitimate and something else not legitimate. Looking at the European experience of the past centuries, we can look at war makers and state makers, the kings or the presidents, as coercive, self-seeking entrepreneurs. And this is a more effective explanation rather than the idea of an open market in which competing states offer services, or the idea of a society buildings from bottom up, so shared norms, or the idea of a social contract. So the idea of the use of violence as a way of building states is rather interesting, and is summarizing what do the states do in these ways. War making, that is neutralizing their rivals outside the territories where they have the priority as wielders of force. State making, that is neutralizing the rivals inside those territories and building the capability to organize power and control over there. Protection, eliminating the enemies of the clients, protection versus basically the economic actor and the social actors present in the territory, and also extraction, which means the ability to acquire the means for carrying out the first three activities. This is the summary of Tilly's model. We have armed power with an expansionist drive. And this armed power can be internal to a state, or the state cannot exist at the beginning, and can use both internal power and external conflict as a way to build war-making capabilities. These war-making capabilities leads to extraction, plundering, tributes, taxes, but also debt, the ability to raise funds through debt. So the extraction of economic resources makes war-making possible, but at the same time, war-making leads to state-making, because if you do wars, you have to have a centralized power, building a bureaucratic system, building supply systems, build the ability to raise taxes to fund wars, and at the same time engage with economic activities that provide the resources, economic, material, arms, and so on, which at the same time support the process of accumulation. Protection has to be understood as the relationships with economic and social actors, which can be both part of the social bloc controlled by the armed and political power. And in this case, what do we have? We have the expansion of the possibility of these economic and social actors to feel protected, safe in their activities, but also to expand. And in capitalism, Tilly was starting investigation in medieval Europe, but now we are talking about a capitalist economy. What we have is the ability of economic actors, multinational corporation, Wall Street, the rich, the financial classes, and so on, to expand their economic activities and profits with the military protection of war-making capabilities and with the political protection of state-making. Okay, and in turn, of course, these economic activities provide the resources for the extraction, so pay in some way for the war-making and the state. That is becoming a very important element now. And of course, this system works if this is a sort of virtuous circle. So a little war-making, a little extraction lead to a large political power and a large economic power. If, on the other hand, as in failed states in developing countries or in civil wars in Africa, we have a lot of war-making, little to extract, weak states or failed states, and very little economic activities, the end up is a vicious circle of civil wars and use of war or coup d'etat or military power just to control the limited resources that poor countries have. Okay, so in a way we can look at this as a virtuous model for successful, powerful, developed states and developed economies, the West in particular, but also as a vicious circle of militarization and civil war and impoverishment, which tells us a lot of stories about third world tragedies. By the way, Tilly was looking at the emergence of wars in the third world as an interesting case. Of course, he did not envisage that this model would be a perfect interpretation of Trump's United States today also, but we will get to there. Okay. So what an interesting point looking at the history of Europe, he says that the idea of building a nation state was not clear in the mind of François Premier or other French lords in the 15th century. It was the way in which the relationship between state, military power, and private economy, the rise of capitalism, and the availability of banking and resources interacted to create a particular outcome. So an important part of the story, an important element in all this summer school, is that there is no determinism, okay? when you hear someone telling that war is inevitable, this is the most dangerous lie that you can hear. And a deterministic perspective on these issues is completely wrong, because history tells us a variety of possible outcomes. And of course, we have to, the specific historical outcome that we see, we have something we have to come to terms, but this is not inevitable. There has always been the possibility of alternatives, okay? And so in this sense, history is important. By the way, Palazzo Strozzi was built by the Strozzi family, who was an important banking family, rival to the Medici. And of course, the finance activity of Strozzi was important for explaining wars and the lack of state making in Italy in the 15th and 16th century. Okay, so Italy is an interesting case where the Tilly story of state making was a failure, and we managed to unify, as you know, only 150 years ago. Okay, so Tilly, being also a scholar of civil society and revolutions, looks at this dimension also at the domestic level, in social terms. Looking at Europe, populations, people, peasants or working classes were not passive subjects. They were the subject of extortion, extraction, taxation, and so on. But at the same time, they were able to revolt, create civil wars, revolutions, and so on. And in Europe, we had the French Revolution as an important starting point in this direction. So what has been happening? We have to recognize that people, social classes, civil society, and so on, has the power to respond to the strategies of the military and the strategy of political power with their own tools. And as a matter over history, what we have seen through a sequence of negotiation from the Magna Carta to the British Revolution, to the English Revolution, to the French Revolution, to the Soviet Revolution, a range of negotiation between rulers and ruled in order to create a number of protection for the people. For instance, the welfare state is an important compromise between the strategies of war-making power, the First World War and the aftermath, and the need to reconstruct a consensus after the two world wars in Europe. And therefore, we have a number of counter forces at the national level, and democracy is very important because it's exactly the domain where these struggles between top and bottom-up forces can be located. So this is an interesting, by the way, an argument of Tilly is that while in Europe this interaction also at the national level was very intense through history, in the third world, the creation of states without a prolonged domestic process of negotiation between civil society and political power created a military elite which found very easy to concentrate military power and use it to control state power. And therefore, the lack of this domestic process of containment of the excesses of military and political power was a problem. Of course, looking at in the future, the increasing destructiveness of war, we have thousands of nuclear warheads which can destroy the planet as a whole, the expanding role of great powers of suppliers of arms, and the growing importance of military rule around and authoritarianism in the world are all worrying aspects. So let's come now to our own phase, and in our time, we look now at the other paper you have in the folder, Domination Without Hegemony by Payne and Silver, which is a development of the work of Giovanni Arrighi in previous studies. The idea is that we have to understand now the decline of US hegemony. We can conceptualize the US hegemony in the post-World War II period up until the 80s as a period where the US hegemony offered legitimate protection, at the same time allowing wide economic growth, consensus, and in a stable state systems, and a number of limited war in the periphery with the Cold War confrontation. But then after 1990, we have a decline of US power, economic and political, and at the same time, a strategy to assert the primacy of the US as a single superpower. So what are the components of this decline? We have a slower material expansion of the system, the rise of finance, we have already discussed this, greater instability, higher concentration and high inequality, greater uncertainty on the economic future, and in political terms, we have challenges to hegemonic power and the expansion, as we said, of local wars to begin with. In social terms, we can add that there is a crisis of the social bloc that was coherent with the phase of economic expansion and political power. In the West, the the Keynesian welfare state compromise allowed the improvement of the condition of the working class, the creation of a large middle class, and a number of social protection with the welfare state and so on. But with the economic crisis, this and with the 3 or 4 decades of neoliberalism, we have a weakening of this social compromise, and the outcome is that this consensus ends, and the waves of populism and the waves of authoritarian and the waves of election of extreme right governments in many countries are the reflection of this breakdown of the social bloc that was coherent with the phase of the good years. So if we have to put together these elements, we can say that we start from a situation of old hegemonic power, which allows the expansion and encourages the emulation. So Japan and Europe emulated the model of the US, both in mass industrial production, in mass consumption, in cultural values, and so on, and in political dynamics. And but of course, the name of the game is that there is no space for everyone. So the American model could be extended to some extent to Japan and the US, but not to the rest of the world. And therefore, the periphery had to be kept controlled through a variety of means, military, political, economic, and therefore the periphery had just to accept this subalternity. When there are crises and transition, the economic success of other states erodes the economic power, so the power of the economic success of Japan and Western Europe eroded the leadership in economic terms of the US, and even more so with the rise of China and other Asian countries. More competition, lower profits, economic crisis, and more state and political rivalry. With the crisis, the cake becomes smaller, so conflict about distribution, both domestic and international, expand, and therefore the consensus breaks down, and we have an hegemonic crisis. What happens now, that's the big difficult questions, we have the old hegemon, the US, who tries to reconstruct its own power, but it doesn't have the means for doing this. So, Make America Great Again means that they did not read Giovanni Arrighi's book, and they don't understand they cannot back to create a leadership in economic and technological terms and in political terms. So there is no way of going from here back to here in structural elements, okay? But the attempt of doing so and of using the military power as a tool for doing creates and expands the systemic chaos until there is a new balance emerging, which could be a new hegemon, as happened in the past, the US taking over after the UK, or a different type of organization of the world in a less militarized way. Okay. An interesting aspect is that each transition from one world order to another was rooted in the expansion of the sphere of control to another aspect. For instance, the UK, the Dutch were before the Industrial Revolution, so there was no production into the system. But with the Industrial Revolution, the British Empire ruled the world through the power of the Industrial Revolution, okay? So the production activities was incorporated into the dynamics of the world system. In the US, with the US power, what happened was the integration of the whole world into a system of economic and financial activities. So the ability to integrate the whole world was important. The problem that we are facing now for the reproduction of the system is that all of the above were made possible by the unlimited exploitation of natural resources without any attention for the limited characteristics of nature and the need for natural reproduction. And therefore, the challenge that we are facing now is exactly the ability to combine economic and political development with the reproduction of nature and climate change, sustainability, and so on. So this is an important element that has to be kept in mind. So in other words, capitalism and also the world system need to create a condition for its reproduction, both in terms of capital and labor. If you have slaves, it's very difficult to reproduce labor, of course, or people starving, but also we have the environmental process that becomes a very important aspect, okay? So the process of reproduction in social terms and in natural terms become crucial for the challenges of today. Okay, so going to the conclusions, to understand the decline of the US hegemony, we have to put together all these elements, economic and political dimensions, the neoliberal context, and also the waves of militarization. And in the article by Payne and Silver, you have a reconstruction of how the attempt of the US to behave as the single superpower after the end of the Cold War led to a variety of wars, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, which were mostly unsuccessful, with a role of the war as a way in which the extraction of support and resources from allied countries become more important. In a number of studies, we can say that a very large part of the external debt of the US, which is huge now, as you know, has been related to the carrying out of wars. There is a book by Linda Bilmes, which is forthcoming. Linda Bilmes is a Harvard expert of public finance who co-authored the book with Joe Stiglitz on the Iraqi war. She documents how in the US politics after Vietnam, all administrations have carried out wars without cutting civilian expenditure within the budget and without going through the parliamentary process, but setting aside extra budget funds, basically all funded by debt, mainly external debt, that is the rich of all the world buying this type of bonds to fund US wars. And so, in other words, insulating the ability to create, to do wars abroad from both the domestic democratic process of parliamentary debate and from the domestic economic constraint of having to choose between guns and butter. So in a way, the Americans so far were lucky not to have, after Vietnam, to suffer reduction in public expenditure in order to finance war, because there was this financial debt mechanism that operated. Of course, this cannot go on for a long time. And of course, we have to pay attention to what is likely to happen. Just to conclude, the interesting emphasis of this article by Payne and Silver is that Trump is, of course, extreme, but is not really that extreme. There is a continuity after the 90s in the US policy with the shades, more confrontation with China or a bit less confrontation, but always weakening of the European Union as a client, challenge to BRICS rather than incorporating them. And broadly, after the period of globalization and global order, we have been dismantling the international order as an order based on rules, but even more and more we have bilateral power relation as driving the balance of power. And now what we have, this combination of military, political, economic, and business and technological action all mixed together in order to achieve a particular gain. I've been working a little bit on tariffs. We have now 90 countries which have accepted the unilateral imposition by the old hegemon of 15% tariffs. The UK, considering the past, have been given a discount to 10%. Deep clashes with Canada and Mexico, extreme political fight with Brazil and India, and systemic challenge with China, who is the only player who has not acquiesced to the US arms twisting. But now we have a whole set of teams. The US has asked NVIDIA, the exporter of high-tech chips to China, to pay part of the profits as an extra tax, has become the co-owner of Intel, which is another high-tech. So we have not just tariffs are unprecedented in the context of the neoliberal agenda of free trade, but we are looking at unprecedented roles of the state, telling one company to do some technology and not the other, telling drug makers that they have to pay 100% tariffs if they export to the US. And at the same time, the US is telling now other countries to continue to buy US debt and to continue to open up finance in spite of the fact that the dollar, as a matter of fact, has declined 10% vis-a-vis the major currencies. So we have all the sign of a return to brutal power relationship, but also economic weakening. So short-term acquiescence, China patient confrontation, long-term weakening of the US power, and therefore we have to understand that our time is an age of systemic chaos, and the wars and the peace efforts have to be put in that context. Where we have always to pay attention to the combination of all these elements. Also because the solutions to wars and to systemic chaos have to provide answer in this economic, political, and social dimension. So the debate on the future ranges from a concern about the effort by the US to restore its power through military means, the possibility of a multipolar system where we have a variety of centers of power in the world which cooperate, reconstructing a multilateral system, which is not liberal in the old sense, and the possibility of rise of China in the long term as a new hegemonic power, which, looking at history, has the strength that the place of material accumulation is China now. So if we look at the history of the emergence of the new powers, all the new powers emerged as leaders in the ability to develop new technology, new economic activities, new production, new jobs, and so on. So in this sense, looking at the past, this could also be a possibility.